For the people that don't know you, Mr. Goldstein, who are you?
Well, actually, I'm a classical archaeologist by training. I haven't dug in the field for 30 years, 40 years, but I trained as a classical archaeologist. I taught at University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. I went off to the Corning Museum of Glass for a year as the visiting curator, and then suddenly stayed for a decade. So I got into the museum world and then went from Corning to the St. Louis Art Museum. And I just retired from there about 4 years ago. So I was there 26 years. So I've really only held 3 jobs in my life.
How does it feel?
Very satisfying, and retirement is great fun. It allows me to come to Brussels and participate in the Art Connoisseurs program, which was also very, very satisfying and extremely interesting. So, you know, I can't complain at all. I have no complaints. I'm extremely lucky, an extremely lucky person.
How did you get involved into glass? How did it happen?
Completely by accident. I was an undergraduate at the University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri. My professor's wife, my professor was Saul Weinberg, who was a Bronze Age specialist in Greece. His wife was a very famous archaeologist who specialized in glass. She and the Corning Museum of Glass were doing an excavation, and because of chance, I was invited as an undergraduate to join that group as a staff member. So I got to go to a dig when I was less than 20, and I spent 2 summers at that excavation, which was the excavation of a glass factory. And basically the excavation was, we lived, I thought we were going to live in tents and eat out of tin cans. In fact, we lived in a pension in a resort town called, it was near Nazareth, and we worked at a little site in northern Israel near Haifa. We had wonderful food. I had a Jeep, so I was quite mobile, and I thought, gee, if this is archaeology, I could do this for the rest of my life. So then I went to Sardis in Turkey as a graduate student, and Sardis was 35 staff members at its peak, and we were completely encamped in the compound for 6 of 7 days, and it was a very different experience. So I didn't work on glass there. I worked on metallurgy, and I was a conservator archaeologist, so I was in the lab part-time and I was in the field part-time. So that's sort of my experience. And then you either went off to teach, or you went into museum work, or you might become an archaeologist. So I went off to teach, and I taught for a few years. And because I worked at a glass factory as an undergraduate, I was labeled as a glass expert, so I just sort of gave into it. And I did my thesis on Roman glass, on the Roman glass factory we excavated, and then sort of went to the Corning Museum of Glass, and I started out as curator of ancient and Islamic glass and became chief curator. And basically all we did was look at glass and study glass, because the museum had no other collections. So when I left Corning and went to the St. Louis Art Museum, it was actually great fun. Not that I didn't like Corning, but it was great fun to sort of have the expanse of a world collection, a comprehensive collection of materials, so that you could look at Max Beckmann's, and you could look at Islamic tiles, and you could look at virtually anything. We had ethnographic materials, we had archaeological materials. So it was a wonderful experience. And I think the two museum collections in the 2 cities sort of balanced my worldview of museums and of archaeology and of art history. So.
How will you define the relationship between collectors and museums?
Well, I mean, from my experience, the Corning Museum of Glass is a very different kind of institution, very small, very focused, and in a relatively isolated area, the town of Corning. In St. Louis, at the St. Louis Art Museum, the relationship of the board of directors, or the trustees, the curators, and collectors is really very, very close. I mean, people get interested in the museum. They may or may not collect, but those are the people who serve on the board. So we have extensive collectors, very, very sophisticated collectors who are on the board. There are, people who are just starting out on the board, and the curators basically work with those collectors to help in any way they can. They'll look for things on the market for them. If they're traveling and see something that might be of interest, they'll look at something that the collector has seen and brought back and says, is this what they say it is? So the curatorial staff will not appraise, because that's an ethical situation for the museum, for any museum staff, but they will certainly look at an object and sort of authenticate the object and confirm that this is actually what the dealer said it was. I think there are no dealers on the St. Louis Art Museum board. I don't know if that's sort of nationwide, but basically collectors are certainly welcome on the St. Louis Art Museum Board of Trustees, and there are lots of them.
Maybe it's some kind of exchange.
I think one can say that. It's not a one-for-one situation, but the St. Louis Art Museum doesn't have the situation where there's a fixed amount of money that you sort of are suggested to offer in order to sit on the board. I mean, the board basically selects the board at the St. Louis Art Museum, and some people are able to be very generous, and other people are not. It's a broad range, because the art museum is. We're very, very lucky in that the museum is publicly supported, so that there's a tax that supports several institutions in the city. It's called the Zoo Museum District, and so there's a property tax. A portion of the property tax actually goes to support the institution, and it's a wonderful thing that was instituted in 1971. And it supports the zoo, our botanical garden, the art museum, and the history museum, and it's fantastic. It really, the science museum as well, and so St. Louis Art Museum is and always has been free to the public. So there's no charge to come in. There's a charge for exhibitions, but not to see the permanent collections.
What was the beginning? For you to decide I will dedicate my life to art, or to the study of art? How did that happen?
It's a great question. I'm not sure I really have the answer to it. I mean, I didn't think seriously about going into archaeology until I was already in it. When I went away to the university, I was really thinking I would probably go into business and possibly go into the hardware business, but that didn't work out. And all I can think of is when I was in grade school, we had a show and tell one day, and one of the children in the class brought what she said was a little faience figure from, I don't know, she said it was from Tutankhamun's tomb, but it was an Egyptian figure, and she broke it in class. And I thought, people shouldn't have these things in their personal collections if they can't take care of them. So I don't know if that sort of put my mind toward archaeology and museums. But in any case, it was an experience that I remember, and I don't remember her name, but I can picture the incident still today.
Well, if you were talking to your grandson or grandchild or someone very young. If I ask you the question, what did a life dedicated to research and art brought you?
Oh goodness, enormous satisfaction. I mean, it's given me the opportunity to travel. It's given me the opportunity to meet people. It's given me the opportunity to handle objects. And I think if you're an objects person, even if you aren't a collector, if you're in a museum situation, once you've handled an object, it's pretty hard to go back to simply talking about objects from two-dimensional images on a screen. And I mean, that's what's so wonderful about coming to Brussels is, you walk down the street, you walk into shops, you walk out of shops, you may be absolutely focused on ancient glass, and you see an oceanic shield that absolutely blows you away, and so you're completely distracted. And I think that happens in this fair more than any other fair that I've ever gone to, because most other fairs are in huge buildings with 10 billion watts of light, and they're usually 108 degrees. And I just, being in Brussels and being able to walk around the Grand Sablon and sort of see all your friends and meet new people on the street is really quite wonderful. And it's what brought me back now 11 times, so hope to come back.
Thank you, Sidney. That was very good. Sidney, yesterday you made a very interesting lecture, but you didn't want to be filmed. Can I ask you why?
I don't particularly like to be filmed, but that's the basic issue. But because I tend to talk off the cuff and don't usually do a prepared lecture, so sometimes I will add something that I will realize later is incorrect. Sort of having it for posterity on film is not something I'm really looking forward to. But I think the other thing is that this is a collection that's still growing, and it's a collection that I've just spoken about in Kuwait at a symposium, and this is only the second time I think that this material has really been shown. So I thought it would be more appropriate to have that kind of a production come out of the collector as opposed to my providing it here.
Regarding the lecture yesterday, you mentioned the goddess lion, the divinity object, saying that the one with the head like this.
The Quenelle, yeah.
And you mentioned that was one of the, maybe you said the most fabulous object that you have seen, as far as I remember. Can you explain us why?
The Quenelle lioness, without a photograph, for anyone who has seen it, is just an incredibly powerful figure. It's a combination of the head of a lioness on the body of a superannuated or a super attenuated muscle builder. So it's this figure who is holding its hands and turning really to flex her muscles. And it's enormous. It's enormous, but it's only about 5 inches high. And it's made out of this very wonderfully polished and very well sculpted material of magnesite. It's like a marble, a softer marble. But the carving on it is so amazing, and the power of the object is so extraordinary that I literally sort of made a pilgrimage to see it every time I could go. Every time I had enough time when I visited New York City that I could go to Brooklyn, because it's been in Brooklyn for 40 years. And I don't know how many times I've gone to see it, and every time it would raise goosebumps on my arms, because it really is I think it is the most amazing object, period. I don't think you have to limit it to antiquity. I don't know of another object that causes that reaction in my brain. And I was talking to a collector at this exhibition in Kuwait, actually, and we were going around looking at the various early objects, and I mentioned this object, and he just stopped in his tracks, and he said, "Yes, you're absolutely right. It's the most extraordinary object he'd ever seen." So I think people who have seen it in the flesh are just in awe of it. It really is amazing. And the object in the Al Sabah collection is enormous and extraordinary, but it doesn't have the same power. And I think it's very, very easy to see that. The only object in terms of causing goosebumps is we had an exhibition. This is completely off the path of your inquiry. Is we had an exhibition of masks at the St. Louis Art Museum, which was organized by the museum and traveled around the country. It was incredibly successful, and it considered masks from basically the Paleolithic or the Chalcolithic period up to contemporary times, to hockey masks, and how masks transform people. And there were two objects in that exhibition which were not, which were powerful, but which to me were terrifying. And the Quenelle lioness, there's sort of an awe in the amazement, but there was a Chalcolithic shell mask, or I'm sorry, I think it is a shell mask, very, very simple, which seems to have been placed over the head of the deceased in the mid-late 4th millennium BC, and it was extremely powerful. And at the other end of that, exhibition, there was a shaman's cloak from Africa, which was covered with amulets and objects all sewn onto this cloak. And as I'm talking about it, I'm starting to get a very strange feeling. And it had packets of different materials. It had skulls and birds and all sorts of things. And our crew, only one person would get near it to install it. It just had this presence and sort of power that you felt. And basically in the gallery, with the proper light level, it was a rather low light level, kids would come into the gallery and they would walk around it. I mean, they'd walk as far away from it as possible. It was a terrifying object, which is exactly what it was supposed to be. It was supposed to emanate this power, and it's exactly what it did. We, in fact, turned the light up on it so that it was a little less terrifying, but people wouldn't touch it to install it. It was such an amazing object. So that's the kind of thing I sort of love seeing, and whether it's an antiquity or a piece of glass or a shaman's cloak, amazing stuff. The civilization has produced some amazing things.
Because when you say, "Oh, this is amazing," I can see the kid, I can see someone that is not the curator of the very well-known, worldwide known, but just someone that.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And it's usually an object that's been made with some purpose, and it's been made by a person by an artist or a craftsman who creates something wonderful. And there are great craftsmen, and there are not such great craftsmen. And I mean, you see that in the market. The wonderful objects move you, and the not so wonderful objects are nice to have, and they're good examples of things, and they're wonderful and comforting, and it's nice to own them. But the great object blows you away, and it always happens, no matter what culture.
Are you a collector yourself? Do you collect for yourself?
I do, yes. Very modest, very small, and my wife collects, and so we have veto power over each other's acquisitions, but we usually buy things together. So, she likes more contemporary things. I tend to like everything else, but I do like contemporary material, and we buy contemporary glass, so it goes across the board.
Can you see some major changements in the market since 30 years?
In 30 years, I think the biggest change in the market is the price. Maybe not. Well, the price of ancient glass has risen much more for the very fine objects and very rare objects. But if we can move that chronology up, I mean, the change in contemporary glass is spectacular. I mean, in the 70s, you could buy contemporary glass for hundreds of dollars. Maybe a few artists were getting a few $1,000s, and now, it's not unusual to see contemporary glass at $250,000. It's mind-boggling. The scale is usually a lot larger, but still the cost of contemporary glass has really risen dramatically. And I think the cost of antiquities has risen, but it's that the great object will always demand a huge price, and the other objects will sort of rise with the tide. But when you compare it to contemporary art, contemporary paintings, 19th century paintings, it's very affordable. It's very affordable. there's a huge amount of ancient glass that's been on the market for a very long time, that's been in private collections, that's been around and available, and simply moves in and out of the sales rooms and into the dealer's stock. And you can find very nice examples of Greek vases, little miniature glass vessels in the shape of Greek vases. You can find early Roman blown vessels right through the 5th century AD. Basically, you can buy glasses for hundreds of dollars, and you can buy glasses for thousands of dollars. I mean, you can buy some very nice glasses for under $10,000. You can buy some very nice glasses for $100,000. But it's available across the range. I mean, it's not that you have to spend $10,000 to get a decent piece of glass. And they're wonderful glasses in the fair. You know, there's always a nice selection of glass, ancient Roman glass, in the Brussels Fair.
That's why you came.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I always see something interesting at the Brussels Fair, and I'm not buying for the museum, but I always see something interesting and something unusual. So it's great to come back.
Yeah.
And absolutely, I think many glass collectors start with very simple Roman shapes, and literally you can buy them for a couple of €100, and then you get hooked and you decide, well, you know, I want a more refined shape, or I want something that's a mosaic glass, more complicated in fabrication, or I want something that's a little more rare, and then you sort of build. I mean, that's the classic way that people get into collecting ancient glass.
What would be the because we are I don't want to take too much of your time, because I know that you want to see all this. What would be the advice you would give to a newly born collector of glass or antiquities?
Oh, it's very simple advice, and I think people give it all the time. Buy something that you like. You know, buy something that you actually, not that you like, but buy something that you love. I mean, if something really speaks to you, buy it. Don't buy for investment. It's just not the thing to do. It hardly ever works out. So if there's something that you see and you really love it, you love the shape or the color or the you know, whatever, the history behind it, the story that goes with it, then buy it. But don't buy it because you think in 10 years it's going to be worth 3 times as much. That would be my single bit of advice.